All right, everyone, again, welcome. My name is Lance Marshall. This is The Gathering. I'm so glad that you're here. If this is your first time here, I'm the guy who talks 99% of the time at The Gathering, but there are occasionally guest speakers and preachers. I want to thank all of you for coming last week when the bishop was preaching. For those of you who don't know, the bishop is my boss's 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 boss. And I invited him to come speak at The Gathering, and he did. And I just cannot thank you enough for showing up. I cannot thank you enough for worshiping with us. I cannot thank you enough for laughing at his jokes. Thank you. Thank you, thank you, thank you. I also want to extend a special word of thanks for all of you who pointed out to him that I had promised to wear a tie and then didn't, because at the 11 o'clock service in front of everyone, he took off his tie and made me put it on in front of everyone in this weird act of control. He was like, wear a tie, child. And I was like, I'll wear a tie, That's not exactly how it went, but that's how it felt. I really appreciate all of you, and I appreciate him so much. I'm so thankful. I didn't realize how well his style actually was going to fit with The Gathering, because one of the things that I get a lot of flack for, particularly from the people who run the cameras, is that I like to walk like 2 or 3 aisles deep, while I'm preaching in the service, but he walked clear to Michigan. He was like all the way back. He was like high-fiving in the back of the room. I didn't even know that was possible. I don't even like it. It's uncomfortable. I want to go back. So I learned a lot. I appreciate him being here. And he stepped in the middle of a series. So we'll talk on these series here at The Gathering, and series can come to us in a bunch of different ways. Sometimes it's a book of the Bible we need to spend a lot of time with. We spent 7 weeks on Revelation, helping people kind of understand what the book of Revelation is and what it isn't. We did that at the beginning, this time last year. Sometimes we'll talk on a conversation, something like the intersection between faith and science. We did that a lot earlier in the year. The series that we're in right now is based on the number one question, the number one request that I get from people, both in individual conversations and one-on-one meetings, in times that have happened when I've asked for feedback on what it is that the gathering should be talking about, what you are saying back to me on what people need direction for from their church. And the number one question has been something along the lines of, what am I here for? Something along the lines of, what am I here for? And it's usually in the context of, like, what's next for me? Right? What's my calling? What's the path that God has placed me on? Where do I go next in this journey? There are all different ways of asking this question, right? You seem to have a calling. How do I get one of those? Right? Other people seem to have a ministry or a purpose. How do I get one of those? Other people have had some experience of praying for discernment or guidance when they're at one of life's forks, and they seem to walk out of that experience with some sort of assurance or encouragement, and I desperately want some of that. How do I do it? Does that make sense? That's one of the number one questions that I've received in the years of ministry that I've been here at this church. And so we were taking a really focused time to dive in on that, to not only explore the theology of how God works in each and every one of our lives, but also to equip you with some hands-on practices to help you, engage on this journey and to approach these points of discernment and questioning and choosing, right? So the first week was 2 weeks ago. And we talked the foundation of this process, right? The foundation of this interaction, this work of discernment begins with prayer, right? Duh, that's not a surprise. But particularly, it's not just prayers of, God, reveal your will to me, right? The act of praying for discernment is not just asking for help. It's not just requesting some guidance. It's not just saying, hey, I'm open to suggestions, drop a letter in the box, please. Right? It's so much more than that. All of those things are fine, but the foundation of prayers for discernment, of prayers for direction, of requesting guidance from God in series of times when you're looking for it are prayers of trust. And they're prayers of grounding oneself in who God is and what God does. We use Psalm 16 as a guide for this. Do you remember? Psalm 16 is a psalm that teaches us to pray. It roots us in this understanding of praising God for who God is, of reminding ourselves of God's faithfulness in the past to us and to others, of reflecting on all that we already have, all that we've already received, all that we've already learned and come to know and to be and do in the world because of God's action in our life. So the beginning is not just prayers of saying, God, help me. It's not just prayers of saying, God, I'm looking for directions. It's not just prayers of saying, God, zap me on the head with an idea of what to do next or to choose left or right. It's a deeper rooting in trust in who God is or what God does, right? Does that make sense? That's the foundation of where we're starting here, is this relationship with prayer. It's not just the end thing. It's the through line that runs through your entire relationship with God. Last week, the bishop came in, and he gave you kind of an overview. right? If you're going to be engaging in this process, if you're going to be asking God for discernment, right? If you're going to be asking for direction, if you're going to be asking for support, for encouragement, if you're going to be requesting a calling, a task, a purpose to be given to you or revealed to you, if you're going to be asking all this, remember what Christ says he wants from you, right? The Apostle Paul gives us this admonition when he's writing to his church. Remember to live a life worthy of the gospel. That is where it starts. If you're going to be asking for a purpose, if you're going to be praying to God for a revelation, if you're going to be asking for help, remember that everything roots back to living a life worthy of the gospel. Right? God's not going to give you a direction or a purpose that is going to lead you down to a path of destruction or despair or hopelessness or greed or idolatry. Right? The only directions you are going to receive from God in your life are going to be toward a life worthy of the gospel. And you need to be listening and thinking in that way if you're ever going to connect with where God is leading you. Does that make sense? Of course, God is not going to give you, in the hours of your prayers and supplications, directions that are going to lead you to addiction, greed, hopelessness, or despair. Right? God is trying to lead you to a life worthy of the gospel. So be thinking and understanding things in that way so that when you actually start to hear back or to feel or to know what is next, it will resonate with that. So those are the things we talked about the last 2 weeks. These are some sort of foundations. The next 3 weeks, this week and the 2 following, I am going to give you some exercises. I'm going to give you some tools. I'm going to give you some materials that can actually help you, guide you. I'm actually going to give you homework. I know you asked for it. You're like, look, Lance, I go to the gathering. It's an hour out of my Sunday. Love it. Is there any way you could give me some materials with which I could fill my free time in the remainder of the week? And I'm like, good news. The Lord will provide. I've got some exercises I need you to do. I've got some things I need you to work on, and they all come through the understanding of this. You have a calling. You have a purpose. You have a God-given role in this world, and that lives right here. That's a heart. That is not a heart. It's a star. Man. You set it up and you try so hard and then you lose it over drawing. You have a God-given purpose. You have an identity. You have a mission. You have something, right, that you can do that nobody else can do. Actually, there is something that you can do uniquely based on who you are and who God made you to be and what God has done in your life and will continue to do in your life that nobody else can do. And it lies at the intersection of these 3 things, right? So we're going to talk about these for the next 3 weeks. And the first one is your story. Your purpose, your calling, your mission, your what's next, your now what lies at the intersection of these 3 things, and the first thing is your story. That's what we're talking about today. So there is a season in October in the church that leads up to All Saints Day. All Saints Sunday is the first Sunday in November, and it's a day where we celebrate the lives of those who have come before us, those who teach us what it is to be faithful, to walk in God's world and to lead his disciples. And so in the month of October, I like to lead up with something called the Season of the Saints, where I'll bring in stories and backgrounds of some people who particularly model what it is to live in this way. And there's a story of a woman that I fell in love with that I want to keep telling over and over and over again. So if you heard this before, fall asleep, wake back up in 3 minutes. There's a story of a woman named Mary McLeod Bethune. I found a picture of her. So this is a picture of Mary McLeod Bethune toward the end of her life, around the 1950s when photography had gotten a lot better. And Mary McLeod Bethune is an amazing woman, a sister in Christ, an incredibly strong disciple, and she ended up having an incredible impact. An African-American woman who lived in the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century ended up having an incredible impact on our government, on our society, on the way that we view education, and she had this incredibly outsized impact for a woman, and it started from the most humble of places, right? She was born in 1875. Here's a picture of her home. This is her childhood home. It's a cabin in South Carolina. She was born to former slaves who had then been freed. She was the 15th of 17 children who were raised in this home. So, imagine you're watching HDTV and we were thinking about what is or is not acceptable for a family home. Remember that you can raise 17 kids in a one bed, no bath, right? That's a possibility. This is her childhood home in South Carolina, 15 of 17 kids. And early on, of course, their family is doing everything they can to just survive. Her mom is helping support the family through doing wash of the people in town, right? So they're walking through town and doing laundry. And early on, very young Mary McLeod Bethune realizes that she has this encounter, and that is she opens up a book, right, at the home of a young white child. And the young white child takes it away from her and says, "This is not for you. You can't read, and you never will." Right, that's the interaction that she has. This is probably in the late 1800s in South Carolina. And so she says for the rest of her life, she came to realize, like, oh, well, then that's something I need to do. That's a step towards equality. That's a step towards empowerment. That's a step towards me being who I can be and everyone else becoming who they can be too. The ability to read and to write, to receive an education. She realizes there as a child, that's the key. Right? That's the key for me, and that's the key for so many others. She goes on, she receives an education, she begins working as a teacher, but of course she's experiencing sexism and segregation in the American South around the turn of the century, and she comes to realize we can do so much more, and we can be so much more, and so she starts a school in Daytona Beach, Florida in 1904, and teaches 5 girls in a borrowed house with $1.50 to her name and a huge faith in God, saying we can educate these young women of color, and by doing so, we can transform their lives, the lives of their families, and the lives of their community. She starts that school in 1904. Ian, next picture. 1 year later, she has expanded to this many students. How many teachers do I have in the room here? Was that a good classroom size? Is that good? Imagine you have 60 kids, ages 5 to 17, right? Today's lesson plan is chaos, right? She starts the Literary and Industrial Training School for Negro Girls in Daytona, Florida in 1905. 20 years later, emerges with the Cooksman School for Boys. She ends up starting one of the first, most prominent, what is now called a historically black college or university. There's a picture of it here. This is the campus as it stands today in Daytona Beach, Florida. Ian, one more, please. This is where it is now. All of this started with a woman who had an incredible faith in God and with literally nothing but an understanding of what it is to transform the world. She started this school, right? And at the intersection of all of it was her story, her background, her lived understanding of what it is that really makes a difference. Her life was transformed by understanding the importance of education and the doors that it opened, and every single bit of work she did for the rest of her life, from advising Franklin Roosevelt in the White House to starting a university to fighting for integration in our own United Methodist Church. She was a Methodist, of course, right? All of this great work she did was rooted in the understanding of what it meant to actually achieve independence and the chance to succeed, right? Her story was something that she used and that God used for the rest of her life. That's what we're going to be talking about. Turning in your Bible, please. If you'd open up to the book of Acts. Book of Acts is in the New Testament. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John are the 4 gospel accounts of Jesus' life. Jesus is crucified and resurrected in each of those gospel accounts, and the book of Acts picks up with the what now, right? The book of Acts is the story of what happens next. The book of Acts is the story of the early church and the early apostles and the going out and the reaching out and the teaching and the success and the difficulties, the miracles and the failures. Acts is the story of what happens in the world of the early church. One of the things that you need to realize is that the New Testament is all that we have. That's the foundation of the Jesus movement, right? We have the Hebrew Bible and we have the New Testament. Jesus himself wrote 0 words of the New Testament, right? Jesus didn't actually write anything down. All of his quotes are from his followers, right? The stories he told, they wrote them down and recorded them. He actually didn't write anything. About 25% of the New Testament is written by Luke. He wrote the book of Luke and the book of Acts. 20% of the New Testament is written by a man named Paul. Paul's one of the early apostles. He's one of the early followers of Jesus. What we have in this account in Acts 22 is Paul telling his story. What Paul has been doing is traveling around the Mediterranean area, starting new churches, preaching the good news, bringing the gospel of Jesus Christ to people who had never heard it before. right? And at the same time, what he's doing is creating so much controversy in the Jewish communities who find this to be heresy, right? No, there's no way the God of Israel did this. There's no way the God of our Jewish faith would be present and active in a man like Jesus. This is not what we were expecting. This is not what we were looking for. There's no way that this is the truth. He has come back to Jerusalem. He's bringing money and offerings to support the people who follow Christ, who are yet impoverished in that community, and he's arrested by the authorities, right? He's arrested by the Jewish community. He's arrested for these teachings. He's arrested for these actions. Who are you to say this? They said. Who are you to do this? They said. Who do you think you are? And one of my favorite pieces of scripture here in Acts 22, Paul says, this is who I think I am. And he tells his story. Right? This is a man who is teaching the world what it is to be faithful and to follow Jesus Christ. And he says, to understand what I'm doing, to understand my mission, to understand my call, to understand what it is that Christ would have me do, you first need to understand my story. This is what he says. Brothers and fathers, and he's speaking to the Jewish community who's interrogating him. Listen now to my defense. When they heard him address them in Aramaic, they became even more quiet. What that's saying is he's speaking their language, right? He's speaking the local language. He's speaking the language of Jewish faithfulness. They didn't think that he could speak the language. He literally speaks the language. Paul continued, I'm a Jew. I'm one of you, born in Tarsus in Cilicia, but raised in this city, raised in Jerusalem. I'm one of you from this community. Under Gamaliel's instruction, I was trained in the strict interpretation of our ancestral law. What he's saying is, you think you know the Bible, the Hebrew Bible? I know the Hebrew Bible. Gamaliel was my rabbi. He's basically saying, like, I went to Harvard. I went to Jewish Harvard for this, okay? I know it. I know it front and back. You think you know? I know. I'm from this town. I speak this language. I received better training than you, and listen to me. I am passionately loyal to God, just like you who are gathered here today. In fact, I harassed those who followed this way, the way being what they called early Christians. I harassed early Christians to their death, arresting and delivering both men and women into prison. The high priest and the whole Jerusalem council can testify about me. I used to be just like you, harassing and killing Christian people. Ask your bosses. They know me. I received letters from them addressed to our associates in Damascus, then went there to bring those who were arrested to Jerusalem so they could be punished. During that journey, about noon, as I approached Damascus, suddenly a bright light from heaven encircled me. I fell to the ground and heard a voice asking me, Saul, Saul, that's what his name used to be, why are you harassing me? I answered, who are you, Lord? I am Jesus the Nazarene, whom you are harassing, he replied. My traveling companions saw the light, but they didn't hear the voice of the one who spoke to me. I asked, what should I do, Lord? He said, get up, the Lord replied, and go into Damascus. There you will be told everything you have been appointed to do. I couldn't see because of the brightness of that light, so my companions led me by the hand into Damascus. There was a certain man named Ananias. According to the standards of the law, he was a pious man who enjoyed the respect of all the Jews living there. He came and stood beside me. Brother Saul, receive your sight, he said. Instantly I regained my sight and could see. He said, the God of our ancestors has selected you to know his will, to see the righteous one, and to hear his voice. You will be his witness to everyone concerning what you have seen and heard. What are you waiting for? Get up, be baptized, and wash away your sins as you call on his name. When I returned to Jerusalem and was praying in the temple, I had a visionary experience. I saw the Lord speaking to me. Hurry, he said, leave Jerusalem at once, because they won't accept your testimony about me. I responded, Lord, these people know I used to go from one synagogue to the next, beating those who believe in you and throwing them into prison. When Stephen, your witness, was being killed, I stood there giving my approval, even watching the clothes that belonged to those who were killing him. Then the Lord said to me, go, I will send you far away to the Gentiles. God speaks to us through the reading of Scripture. Thanks be to God. God has a work for someone to do. In this early world, immediately following the life, the death, the resurrection, and the ascension of Jesus Christ, God has work that someone needs to do. Christ has work that someone needs to do. Someone needs to speak both to the Jewish community that all of their expectations for what God is going to do for the reconciliation and redemption of all people has come true. God needs someone to speak to them. God also needs someone to speak to the non-believers, to speak to the outsiders, to speak to the people who were never part of the covenant community, but who can now, through Jesus Christ, live in full and reconciled relationship with God. God has a work for somebody to do. And what God does, it chooses someone whose story has perfectly prepared them for this work. Does that make sense? God chose Paul. Because Paul's background, because Paul's understanding, because Paul's authority, because Paul's experience, because Paul's zeal would force everybody to listen to him. God had a work that needed to be done, and God chose somebody whose story would perfectly prepare them for it. God chose someone, worked a miracle in their life, and created a person that could work to achieve what God needed to be done. Paul's story prepared him for the work that God had for him to do. Your story has prepared you for the work that God has for you to do. One of the things I need you to do is discover it. 2 minutes ago, you received an email from me. Magic. At 10:15 this morning, you received an email from me and included an assignment. I need you to map out your story. I need you to discover your story. You need you to explore your story, to look at it, to chart it out, and to think about it so you can begin to discover who has God prepared me for. What has God prepared me for? There's instructions in it, and the core of the exercise is something called a life map, right? It's a life map. I have a sample life map up here I'd like to point out to you. This is a life map if you draw it out of Joseph, who's in the Bible. He's in Genesis. Coat, a lot of colors. We'll get there. So this is a life map of Joseph. You can't see these little descriptions. It's too small. But basically the idea is this is the middle line of the graph. This is so-so. Things that are up here at 10 are real high points in your life, real incredible moments. Things that are down here at 0 are when things are really tough and difficult. And left to right are different ages, right? It's years as they pass by. This is Joseph's story mapped out. And it begins with him being the favorite son, right? Great and favored over so many, and begins to go down as he's harassed by his brothers, right? Overlooked by his brothers, tormented by his brothers. Joseph's life starts to get rougher and more difficult. Joseph's life goes up as he has his vision, right? Joseph has a vision given to him by God in which he is the greatest, in which he stands supreme, in which he is a stalk standing up, and all of the stalks of his brothers bow down before him, right? He gets this revelation from God that he will be great, and all of his brothers will be lesser, right? So he's feeling great. And then he tells his brothers, and they strip him naked and drop him in a pit in the middle of the desert. And it's pretty rough. We go down, right? He gets sold into slavery. He ends up getting sold to a man named Potiphar, who's incredibly powerful in the land of Egypt. His life improves dramatically as he's given power and authority, a chance to succeed. Even though he's living as a slave, he's starting to recognize these gifts that he has. All of a sudden, his life goes down as Potiphar's wife tries to seduce him. His life gets even worse as Potiphar's wife lies that he has sexually assaulted her. It gets worse as he's thrown into prison and left to rot. It gets better as he starts to use his gifts to help others be freed. His ability to interpret dreams has resulted in the freeing of others who in turn promise to put in a good word and get him free. And then that guy, forgets. He's done everything he needs to do to receive freedom, and yet he continues to languish in prison. All of a sudden, he has an opportunity to interact with Pharaoh, receives great favor, and is put into a place where he can not only succeed, where he can not only grow, where he can not only achieve, but where he's able and finally prepared and put into a situation where he can do the work that God has prepared him for. Joseph has so much to face in his life, and what he needs to understand, what he needs to do in order to fulfill that work is have a deep and abiding ability to understand that God will be present. God will provide. God will lead me in the work that is set before me, and his story perfectly prepares him for that. I first did a life map exercise, mapped out my own, and it was, if this is kind of our map, and here's the middle, it goes up pretty good. I had a really great high school, and I'm loving it, and I go to college, and boom. And things, then I start work, and it gets worse. Life gets better, cancer. Things get better, cancer's back. Healing, answering a call to ministry, and moving forward. That's how my life map goes out every time I do it. Some of you have no idea what your calling may be, right? And so this practice of exploring and praying and thinking is a question to God, God, what's next, right? Some of you are people like me who actually had a crazy thought, an amazing idea placed in our heads through some miraculous way. For me, it was, you are called into ministry. However, I had no possibility for understanding how that could possibly be me, right? I'm not the kind of person that ministers come from. I don't have the kind of background that leads to ministers in ministry. That can't be me. That can't be me. It wasn't until I started to look back at this story and I started to see someone who hit the bottom when he thought that all this world had to offer was buying stuff and achievement and greed and money, whose life got incalculably better when he started to pursue faith and friends, a life worth living and transforming the world for a better place, where even when he was diagnosed with stage 4 cancer and very low opportunities to survive, it was still nowhere near as bad, because even in the midst of that pain and frustration, he still had something worth living for. And upon receiving some sort of healing, he had the ability to live fully into his common calling and spend the rest of his life sharing this good news that he knows completely and totally is true because of what he's gone through and who he's been prepared for. Everything I do is rooted back to and informed by my story. And so is yours. So as we're going through this process of asking God, what am I here for? What's next? What's for me? Where do I go? What do I do? Left turn, right turn. This person, that person. This job, that job. No job, what job? What do you have for me? Where do I go? What do I do? We start with prayer. We focus on a life worthy of the gospel, and then we turn to reflect on our own story, because the God who loves you, the God who guides you, the God who works in your life has always been working in your life. So let's look back and see what that is so we can start to look forward. And we'll do that next week. Please pray with me. Great and loving God, you are present in each and every one of our lives, then, now, and always. Oh God, as we venture and dare to request to know what it is that you have for us, who you would have us be, where you might lead us, when we open up our arms and our hearts and say, God, where you want me to go, send me, we need to remember, you've always been with us. You've always worked through us. You've always been there for us if we would only listen or seek or know. God, as we delve into our own stories, use them. God, as we explore our own stories, use us. Use us for the changing of hearts and lives. Use us for the transforming of the world. Use us for the coming of your kingdom. And in all things, use us in a manner that makes us more like your Son, Jesus the Christ, in whose name we all pray the words that he taught us to pray, saying, Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done, on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. For thine is the kingdom, and the power, and the glory forever. Amen.